time to remember that we are in the holy presence of God. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Welcome, everybody. I hope everybody enjoyed Bob Scott's presentation last week on the Holy Face of Jesus. We'll be getting a little bit of a taste of that as well in today's talk, as well as looking really at a whole bunch of the relics of Jesus' Passion. As we look at, especially as we are preparing in a couple of weeks for the start of Holy Week, is anybody else just amazed at how quickly Lent is going by? That Holy Week will be upon us. And so the Relics of the Passion is really a talk that I had kind of put together and I've updated periodically based on just my own experience of getting to see many of these relics that are associated with Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. Things that are really extraordinary to be able to see. Is that linked or not? And so really, when we talk about the relics of the Passion, as we know, according to the four canonical Gospels that we have, Jesus underwent his passion, death, and resurrection in Jerusalem. Most historians would date this to about 33 A.D. And so we have as we hear always one of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. This year we'll hear the Gospel of Matthew, the Passion narrative from Matthew on Palm Sunday. On Good Friday, we always hear the Passion account according to St. John. But in all of those Passion narratives, what we really hear is sort of the story of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, how all of those things then came together. I think my battery might have died. No worries. So the sites that are associated with Jesus' passion, burial, and resurrection really quickly became places of veneration by the early Christians, as one can well imagine. One of the things that the Roman Empire, which still controlled Judea and would brutally put down the rebellion by the Jewish population in 69-70 A.D., but the Romans sought to really discourage the Christian faithful from venerating these holy sites. As they looked at the Christians who were going to these places of pilgrimage, to the place of Jesus' nativity, to the state, the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross, and of course, preeminently Jesus' tomb and the mount at Calvary where he died. As they looked at these things, of course, Christians were going and remembering and going to these places, and so the Romans said, well, the easiest way to discourage that is we're just going to build something else on top of it. And so they would build a pagan temple, which in later years would prove to be very useful in knowing exactly where the holy sites were, because the Romans had tried to do so much to sort of erase them and never thought about the fact that, well, the temple you built over it is going to get torn down one day when the Christians are able then to be able to restore those holy sites. So much of the restoration of the holy sites would really occur once Christianity became something that was publicly acceptable. With the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in 313 and his victory that allowed him to take his seat as the Roman Emperor, one of the first things that he did, the first Christian emperor that had existed, one of the things that Constantine did is he moved and began building his new capital in Constantinople, in the eastern part of the empire, a place that was that in many respects sort of power had shifted to the eastern part of the empire. Constantine had a keen interest, although not a great deal of skill when it came to theology. And so Constantine was very interested in promoting the harmony of the church, but he had a real fascination with the historical aspects of Christianity. What are sort of the historical sites? What are the relics that are associated? And he had already carried out he had already done and built a huge basilica, much of which still exists today, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, over the site of Jesus' birth. Most of that basilica still dates to the time of Constantine, the original part of the basilica that encompasses the spot where Jesus was born. But it was really his mother, the Empress Helen, who had never reigned as empress in her own right. She took the title. She was granted the title of empress by her son, Constantine, when he became the emperor. She was sort of the mother empress of the Roman Empire, and she had been a Christian, according to legend, from much earlier in her life. Possibly a convert to Christianity, possibly somebody who had been raised Christian. But of course, the Empress Helen will have a vision that will bring her to Jerusalem. She, like her son, has a keen interest in the origins of Christianity, not just sort of the theology, not just the stories that are told in the scriptures, but really wanting to be able to see where exactly these things took place. Something that the relics of the Passion do is they remind us, and they really root us in the fact that these are real historical events. You know, that the Jesus Passion, Death, and Resurrection is not just some story that we believe in that somebody made up once upon a time, but that it really is something that is very much rooted in history. And so she goes to Jerusalem and takes part in seeking to recover the instruments of the Lord's Passion. So she will be very involved in this whole project of seeking to restore what was happening in the place of where Jesus had suffered, died, and was buried. She goes there then shortly. Constantine is sort of busy with the Council of Nicaea that is going on about this time as well. And so the Empress Helen then goes to Jerusalem in 326, and she helps lead the work on this massive excavation of the location of the Holy Sepulchre and Golgotha. So the mount where Jesus was crucified, and then the tomb, the cave in which he had been buried. And one of the things that they find in the process of this is in a pit near the tomb, there are 3 crosses found. Why 3? You know, obviously because there were 2 thieves who were crucified along with Jesus. You know, when those crosses were dismantled, they were buried in a pit that was not far from the tomb, and they were found along with the nails and the title that Pilate had ordered to be placed on Jesus' cross. So there was a question, according to the legend of the finding of the true cross, about which one of the crosses then, because there are 3 more or less identical crosses tossed in with these other things that had taken place when Jesus was crucified. So which one of the crosses is the one on which hung Christ? On which one of the crosses was Christ's cross, and which one belonged to the 2 thieves? And so what they do is they decide that, well, the true cross of Christ, you know, should probably have, you know, there will be some kind of sign to confirm it. And so they touch the pieces of the crosses to the body of an elderly sick woman who is in Jerusalem, which then miraculously cures her. And so they decide, probably quite logically, that's the one. You know, since they are working with you know, three pieces of wood. And so you can see here in the images, you know, the story of the healing of the woman with the piece of the true cross in the top. In the bottom is today the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is a hodgepodge of a church, because it was designed to encompass pretty much Calvary and the tomb, you know, and the slab where Jesus had been laid out in preparation for his burial. They sort of have all of these things that the church was built to encompass an area of geography. If you have the privilege of visiting the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there is what's called the edicule, this architectural structure that surrounds the tomb. Oftentimes, one of the things that Constantine, in his fervor, oftentimes did is he was very interested in preserving the actual historical site, but not everything else around the historical site. So he almost risked destroying really some of these, because you go there and it's kind of like, this doesn't seem like much of a cave. And that's because he excavated most of it in order to recover the tomb, and then built sort of the edicule, this architectural monument around the place where Jesus lay. So the cave itself is super, super tiny. It was probably once upon a time part of a much larger hillside or something that existed there. But one of the things about the relics of the Passion, we should probably be lucky we've recovered as many as we have, because Constantine in his fervor almost destroyed a lot of things as he went about the work of preserving these relics. This is a church that is called the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. Now, it is not actually in the city of Jerusalem, but there is a reason why it is called the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. This is a church that is actually in Rome. There was once a Cistercian monastery there, but long before that, it was the palace of the Empress Helen in the city of Rome. And so it was her palace, and it is the one to which she brought back many of the relics that she had recovered from the Holy Land during her work over in the Holy Land. And it is called in Jerusalem because one of the things that she brought back was a boatload of dirt from Calvary. And she used that as the foundation for the chapel that she created in order to house these relics that she had brought over. And so the proper title of this basilica in Rome is the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, because it actually sort of sits on soil that was brought over from Jerusalem. The Empress Helena, St. Helen, did things very thoroughly. So she actually brought and carted over soil from Jerusalem in order to use it as the foundation for the chapel of the relics. It was like making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the people of Rome. And so it's a fascinating church. The church itself is not necessarily remarkable by standards. There are far grander churches in the city of Rome. And it's one that is honestly very often overlooked. It is just down the street, an easy walk from the Lateran Basilica, the Pope's Cathedral in Rome, and a lot of people don't realize the treasures that are contained within the Basilica of the Holy Cross. That so many of the relics of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection are preserved there. The things that St. Helen brought back from Jerusalem, some of them added over the centuries, and was considered the most appropriate place to house these relics. And so the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, it's a short walk down the street from the Holy Stairs and the Lateran Basilica, which have tons and tons of people passing through them every day. This is a relatively quiet place where you are able to go, and there is a room now that you are able to view all of the relics of the Passion. But a relatively small church as things go. But again, built in order to house these relics of Jesus' Passion. So some of them that we see, in the top right, you can see the title of the cross. It has a miniature up above it that shows in greater detail what the actual writing looked like on the cross. That it was written, as we are told in the scriptures, the inscription is written on there in Greek, in Hebrew, and in Latin. And so Jesus, King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And one of the curious things about the title of the cross as well is that they wrote it backwards, which was a common thing in the ancient world. If you wanted people to pay attention to something, they would look at it and they would like, wait, what does that say? You kind of like have to take a second look at it. That's like, what exactly does that say? That doesn't look like a real word. And then you realize it's actually done backwards. I have actually seen that used in modern marketing once in a while, where they do something in order to sort of attract attention to it. And so the title of the cross is there, is preserved in the Basilica of the Holy Cross. One of the nails of the cross is also preserved in the reliquary that's in the lower left. There's also to the bottom right kind of a fairly significant piece of the wood of the cross. The relics of the cross, of course, exist in many, many places throughout the world. There are stories that if you put like all of the splinters and wood of the cross, together that are preserved as relics, that it would like make this massive, massive cross. I'm not entirely sure that that's really true. I think skeptics like to say that, but in my experience, relics of the true cross are very rare. The only two that I know of, I think here in our diocese, I think the cathedral has one and Christ the King has one. And they're tiny, tiny, tiny little splinters of the cross. It's very rare, to be able to actually find and venerate. And this is actually sort of a larger piece of the cross, which is preserved. Most of the time, places that have a relic of the true cross, it is genuinely just a tiny splinter. The nails of the cross, nobody is really quite sure whether there were 3 or 4 that were used in the crucifixion of Jesus. And there are various legends, and there are far more nails that exist as relics in various places around Europe. There are far more than could possibly have been used. It's like, Jesus, it would have been, like an Iron Maiden or something, if you took all of those nails. However, part of it was probably the ancient custom of sometimes taking just a filing from a nail and, filing from one of the true nails of the cross and then adding it onto another nail. There are some things that they have discovered that, again, according to legend, some of the relics, like the Iron Crown of Lombardy, which is preserved in outside of Milan, it was supposedly had one of the nails of the cross that had been embedded into the crown of the Lombards in Milan. However, they have since found that it's like 99% silver. So no, Jesus was not crucified with silver nails. There's another nail that exists in Paris, I think. So they're not entirely sure of the provenance of some of the nails. The one that is kept in Santa Croce in Jerusalem is a very good contender as being one of the true nails of the cross. According to one of the legends, one of the nails was lost on the voyage back from Jerusalem to Rome, carrying the relics because of a storm that threatened to swamp the ship. And according to the legend, St. Helen calmed the waters by throwing one of the nails of the cross into the sea. Again, probably just a pious legend, but it would account for one of the nails being missing at the very least. We also see in the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, they have 2 thorns from Christ's crown. The actual crown of thorns, as we'll see in a moment, is kept in Paris. It was something St. Louis IX brought back from that St. Louis brought back from the Crusades. However, the crown of thorns that is kept in Paris has been stripped of all of the thorns. It looks just kind of like a little wreath. No thorns at all, because the thorns had all been stripped away to be distributed as relics in various places. 2 of those thorns are preserved here in the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. There's also the finger of St. Thomas the Apostle, the finger that probed the wounds of the risen Christ. And so the finger of St. Thomas the Apostle is also preserved, as well as the beam from the cross of St. Dismas the good thief. And so the large piece of wood there on the bottom, the Latin inscription there says a part of the cross of the good thief, which would have been St. Dismas. So again, that would have been one of the pieces of wood that St. Helen recovered in Jerusalem during the excavation of Calvary. When they found the pieces of the cross, this was one of the pieces that they determined, okay, that is not part of the true cross. It clearly failed to heal the sick elderly woman on whom they tested it. Some of the other things that we see as well, some of the relics that are kept in St. Peter's Basilica, is the Holy Lance. St. Longinus, who is not mentioned by name in scriptures, although we hear the account of the centurion who uses his spear to pierce the side of Christ, is a feature of the Passion narratives in the Gospels. History and other ancient historical documents have given him the name Longinus, and so the spear of Saint Longinus is preserved in St. Peter's Basilica, where the transepts and the nave cross. There are 4 massive piers that support the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, and this is one of those statues by Bernini of Saint Longinus, and you can see him holding the spear. On the right is a drawing that was made. The lance is very seldom exposed for public veneration. It is preserved in a chapel there in St. Peter's, but this was a circa 1900 a drawing that was done of the lance, and one of the things that you notice is that it seems to be missing its tip. There was a lot of there are a number of other places that claim to have the Holy Lance, the St. Longinus spear that pierced the side of Christ. There are a number of places in Europe that claim to have this. This is actually the most likely candidate. There is a famous one that is kept in Vienna, which is almost certainly far too late a period. It's been dated, and historians have said it's like, no, definitely that is definitely not. It's a Carolingian piece from Gaul. However, this is one that they say is like, no, this would match a first century spear. It is something that was the correct style, but of course it's missing its tip, which might help explain why one of the other places that claims to have a piece of the lance is Paris. Another thing that St. Louis brought back from the time of the Crusades. And in the mid-18th century, one of the popes actually requested that they borrowed the relic from Paris and found that it was a match to this spear. So Paris has the tip of the spear that St. Louis brought back from the Crusades. However, the larger part of the lance is preserved as a relic in St. Peter's Basilica. And a curious thing about the lance as well is that it came into the possession of the Pope. It came into the possession of Pope Innocent VIII after the fall of Constantinople. Constantinople fell in 1453 to the Turks, and so the Sultan who had taken over Constantinople. There were all kinds of internal politics going on, and the Pope was doing the Sultan a solid by keeping by keeping another claimant to the Caliphate. He was keeping him prisoner in Rome in the Castel Sant'Angelo, and basically it's like, as a thank you for keeping this troublesome political figure out of his hair, the Sultan Bayezid II of Constantinople gifted the lance which had been preserved in the Church of the Blessed Virgin in Constantinople. It had fallen into the hands of the Muslim Turks, but then the Sultan gifted it to the Pope. It's sort of a thank you for doing him a favor by keeping somebody imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo. So it's kind of like a little bit of just a little bit of a bribe to keep him in jail and not let him loose to make trouble amongst the Ottomans. And so there's a very good chance that the lance that is preserved in St. Peter's Basilica is the true lance that had pierced the side of Christ. And again, the tip of it is something that is kept in the treasury of Notre Dame. And this harkens back to Bob's presentation last week on the Holy Face of Jesus. We also have in the sanctuary of St. Peter's Basilica Bernini's statue of Veronica, and the story of the Veil of Veronica, how she had ministered to Christ as he was undergoing his passion, as he was carrying the cross, and that she used a cloth in order to wipe his face, and it left an imprint of the face. This has also been subject to testing, and it is found to be a cloth from the 1st century originating in Palestine. There is no clear image of the face. It has metalwork that sort of surrounds the image. But in a lot of ways, I would say, again, there's a very good chance this is if there really was a cloth that wiped the face of Jesus during his passion, this would be a very good candidate, because I've always thought that it's like some of the images that have way too clear, an image of Jesus on them. It's like, is that the kind of thing that would be left as an imprint from a bloody and sweaty face? This is probably a much better candidate, and it certainly dates from the right period. A lot of the radiocarbon dating, a lot of the analysis of it, and so it is actually it's preserved in St. Peter's Basilica, as Bob mentioned, in a chapel that is actually inside the massive pier column that supports the dome, and is displayed on the balcony of that chapel on the fifth Sunday of Lent. So I'm kind of hopeful. I don't know what their schedule is like, but there's a whole group of Bishop Kelly students that's going on their spring break pilgrimage to Rome, and they are going to get to see the relics of St. Francis that are currently on display in Assisi, which is that is genuinely probably a once-in-a-lifetime kind of opportunity. But it is also something, but they would also, if they're there for the fifth Sunday of Lent, they would actually get the opportunity to see the veil when it is displayed in this grand procession that they have on the fifth Sunday of Lent in St. Peter's Basilica. So it is another relic of Christ's Passion, which is preserved there in St. Peter's Basilica. Turning our attention to France and some of the other relics of the Passion, during the Crusades, St. Louis led one of the Crusades and brought back several relics of the Passion, including the crown of thorns and the tip of the lance which pierced Christ's side. The Pope would also give one of the nails of the crucifixion to St. Louis. And so this image depicts the procession with the relics that took place when Louis came back from the Crusades and was bringing these relics back from his travels from the Crusade. The Sainte-Chapelle, or Holy Chapel, was built by St. Louis to house the relics of the Passion. After the French Revolution, the relics got moved to the treasury of Notre Dame, where they're exhibited on the Fridays of Lent and the first Fridays of each month. So the Sainte-Chapelle, this beautiful Gothic masterpiece, just seeming to be supported practically on walls of stained glass, is in the bottom. You can still see part of what had been sort of the massive reliquary that housed all of the in the apse of the chapel is this what used to house the relics. Up above is the crown of thorns, minus its actual thorns. Again, all having been stripped away to be distributed as relics elsewhere. But the actual vines on which the thorns grew make up the actual crown, and then it has been encased in crystal. Of course, what happened, some of these relics actually became were in the news when they had the Great Fire back in 2020 in 2021 of Notre Dame. One of the things that they did is they had to rescue these relics from the treasury. They went in at great risk. One of the priests of Notre Dame went in with a group with a firefighter in order to get these out of the treasury, because there was just a risk that the whole building might collapse. How far the fire might reach within the building, and because the Sainte-Chapelle had been decommissioned as a religious chapel during the French Revolution. Fortunately, the relics were not lost. They were carried a few blocks away to the treasury of Notre Dame, where they have been until the fire, when they were then kept in the National Library in Paris until Notre Dame has been restored now, and the relics have been returned to the treasury of Notre Dame, where they can be properly displayed. But the Sainte-Chapelle, of course, was an actual chapel that was built in order to house the relics of the Passion that St. Louis had brought back from the Crusades. But then it was decommissioned as a religious chapel during the French Revolution. It served at various times as it served largely as a library. It became part of the National Archives, and until it was sort of recovered and sort of they recognized the architectural masterpiece that the Sainte Chapelle was. And so now, of course, it's a place that tourists flock through and are able to visit the upper and lower part of the chapel. But it was a building that was actually built in order to specifically house those relics of Christ's Passion that were preserved. So what do we sort of learn from, I think, what do we really learn from the relics of Christ's Passion? Every year during Holy Week, beginning on Palm Sunday, ending on Easter Sunday, we commemorate the Paschal Mystery, Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. On Good Friday, in a particular way, we venerate in a special way, the wood of the cross on which the body of Jesus hung. The long procession of adoring the cross in that sacred liturgy. The relics of the Passion that St. Helen recovered for us, that had been venerated for centuries by Christians, really reaffirm our faith in the central mystery of our salvation. Jesus, who offered his life as a sacrifice for the forgiveness of our sins. That in many ways, there are always the questions that are asked. It's like, well, how do we know, whether these are real relics, or did somebody just create a really good fake? And I think as Bob mentioned in his presentation last week, that in many ways, whether or not they are the real article, they serve as a focus, of our faith. They remind us of the historicity of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. That again, this is not a fable, it's not a fairy tale, even a very holy one that is being told, but that these are events that are rooted in history. That they are real things that happened. It's something that is, especially as we prepare ourselves, within the church, our custom of venerating relics, our custom of sacramentals is something that is very, very strong. And certainly there are lots of relics that we are well able to verify. It is fascinating when we take things like the Shroud of Turin or the Veil of Veronica or the Lance of St. Longinus, as we look at those things, to be able to see and to understand that it's like, even if some of these articles may not actually be the real thing, as we study them scientifically, it is surprising oftentimes how, in fact, they have been preserved. Things like the Veil of Veronica in the Vatican, that it's like, yeah, this is actually cloth from the 1st century. Using radiocarbon dating and scientific analysis, modern scientific analysis, there are oftentimes very surprising results that it's like, actually, clearly Christians considered these objects to be very important because they did preserve them. In much the same way that ancient Christians remembered the places where Jesus was born. They remembered where it is that he was buried. That even attempts by the Romans to erase some of those sites so that they wouldn't become places of pilgrimage. It's like Christians had, we sometimes have to remember that early Christians had a memory of these things that was being passed down. We talk about how even Scripture is really the product of the oral tradition that then became written down at some point in the books of the New Testament. And in the same way, I'm always kind of like, just because it's sort of popular piety, don't underestimate the fact that in fact Christians have a very long memory of these things because they considered them important. That they were things that reminded us of the historicity of what Jesus suffered and what Jesus suffered, what his death meant, and what his resurrection means for us in our life of faith. I love the fact that they have St. Thomas' finger there in the Basilica of the Holy Cross. That I'm kind of like, yes, doubting Thomas, who is there in the upper room and said he wouldn't believe, unless he could probe the nail marks in his hands and feel the wound in his side. That the historicity of that is something that I think does a lot for us in our own life of faith, to remember that it's not that Christianity is not a made-up religion, but that it is rooted in something that was actual historical fact, and that the relics of the Passion in many ways remind us of those historical facts, that they help us to focus upon the mystery, they help us to focus on Jesus' Paschal mystery, to remember that this is something that he really underwent. There's nothing like seeing one of the nails purportedly used in his crucifixion to feed our religious imagination, and to be able to realize that it's like, yes, something like that at the very least was driven through Jesus' hand and his feet. To be able to contemplate those things is a great way for us to reflect upon the meaning of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, I think, in our own lives. So finally, this is something that I always give as recommended reading to people. It's very short. It is a novella, but is Evelyn Waugh's 1951 novella Helena. You can still find it in print. Lots of different editions available on Amazon if you wanted to order it. But it is a sort of work of historical fiction, the only one really that Evelyn Waugh ever wrote. He was famous for his satire, and there are lots of parts of it that are very entertaining to read. But his novella Helena tells the story of Saint Helen and the finding of the true cross. It kind of begins with her own girlhood. She, according to the legends of her life, she was probably born in Britain, where she then met the man who would become her husband and who would be Constantine's father when he was in the Roman army in Britain. But it's sort of the story begins there, but then picks up again years later after her son has become the emperor, and it follows through the whole story of the finding of the true cross and her time in Jerusalem. So it's very easy to read because it is not a dense scholarly text. It is a work of historical fiction. It's filling in lots of blanks, but it is a very, very good read. I always like to read it during the Lenten season at some point, because it's kind of good devotion. It's a novel that's good devotional reading. It really gave me a lot of insight into who Saint Helen was. Even if a lot of it is sort of very speculative, because again, it is sort of a novel, but nevertheless something that is really an inspiring story of how so many of how this woman who was on a mission, literally just on a mission to go and to find the historical, some of the historical things associated with Jesus' passion, how much that meant to her to be able to find and to prove that these were things that actually happened in history, was something that was really, really a remarkable, short novel. It was, in fact, Evelyn Waugh said it was his favorite thing that he ever wrote. He's known for famous novels like Brideshead Revisited and other things that are his real masterpieces in the literary firmament. However, his work that he liked, that he would read to his family from in the evenings, he would read Helena to his daughters. It was his favorite work that he had ever actually produced, because he, being a Catholic, he found a lot of meaning in that story of Saint Helen and the finding of the true cross that inspired him to write this novella. Does anybody have any questions as we sort of wrap up? We do. In fact, as you go up the ramp from the old Beckerley hallway up into the vestibule, those paintings that we have of the saints along the ramp, those are the 5 saints whose relics are in the altar of the main church. So there's a little bio of each saint that is in there. But the relics that we have, normally they would be first-class relics. One of ours is a second-class relic. The relic that we have of St. Catherine Drexel is a piece of her habit, and that is because the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia won't allow her tomb to be opened to extract more first-class relics. So first-class relics of St. Catherine Drexel are very limited. We also have a relic of St. Maria Goretti, Virgin and Martyr from the early 20th century. We have a relic of St. John Newman, who was the Archbishop of Philadelphia. He was Bishop of Philadelphia back in the mid-19th century. We also have a relic of one of the North American martyrs. There was a 10-year period of time in the 17th century where there were probably about 40 priests who were martyred, Jesuit priests who were martyred in Canada and upstate New York in their missionary activity. And so we don't know, because many of their remains were sort of jumbled together. We aren't sure exactly which one of the Jesuit priests it was, but it's one of the North American martyrs. And then I'm trying to think. We have Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, who is the first native-born U.S. saint. A convert from the Episcopal Church. She converted when she was in Italy. Living with the family, and then came back and largely established the parochial school system in the United States, and went on to found the religious order of the Sisters of Charity here in the U.S. And so those are the 5 relics that we have in our altar. You can have altars that don't necessarily have relics, but there is a long-standing custom in the church that, especially the main altar in a church, when it is consecrated, that it will have a first-class relic of a saint within the altar. Which goes back to the ancient Roman custom of when they would celebrate Mass in the catacombs. Mass was celebrated on the tombs of the martyrs. There would be an altar built over the tomb of a martyr. So martyrs even sort of had a preference as the relics to be encased in the altar because their life had imitated Christ even in his passion and in his death. Mm-hmm. Al?
Could you describe how relics are classified as first class?
Yes, a first-class relic is one that is an actual part of the saint themselves. And so it would be, it might be a fragment of bone or hair or something. I mean, usually it's very, very tiny. Occasionally, you do see like large relics. You will sometimes see like large relics. Like right now, the relics of Saint Francis of Assisi are on display in they are on display in the Basilica of Saint Francis in Assisi, and so they've been put into a glass climate controlled case and everything, and so there are still many parts of the bones of Saint Francis of Assisi. I used to have a first class relic of Saint Francis of Assisi, and I gave it to Father Mike Pratt as an ordination gift because he had the parish, his home parish was St. John in Stillwater, which was where I was pastor at the time, and it was and as a gift for his ordination, it's like the parish bought him a reliquary, and I gave him my first class relic of St. Francis because he had a particular devotion to St. Francis. He had assisted at his first mass as a deacon at the tomb of St. Francis in Assisi. So I was like, well, St. Francis will be with you for your first mass. So we had the relic on the altar for his first mass at St. John's, and so, but yeah, and so that was my first class relic of Saint Francis of Assisi. But I think we have a few in our chapel over in the rectory. I think I have one of St. Thomas Aquinas. I think I have one of St. Clare. And I have a second-class relic of St. Edith Stein. Second-class relics would be relics that were usually something associated with the saint. So they would be things. Associated with the saint. So, like for St. Catherine Drexel, a piece of her religious habit. They have one. A piece of cloth from one of her religious habits that she wore. One of the things that they had at the Newman Center here at St. Philip Neri over here at TU, they have some books that were from John Henry Newman's library that he annotated in his own hand, and they were gifted by a Dr. Tompkins to the St. Philip Neri Newman Center. And there, I was like, I think those are probably technically second-class relics. They're things that John Henry Newman actually made notes in the margins of all of these books, and they were books from his personal library. And as the newest doctor of the church, I'm kind of like, ooh, they're kind of valuable, not just as rare books. They're also sort of like second-class relics. But then a third-class relic would usually be usually a piece of cloth or something which has been touched to a first-class relic. And so a third-class relic is sort of it's sort of like a relic twice removed. It's been touched to, but again, something that is a reminder. One of the things that they found when the tomb of St. Peter was excavated in the mid 20th century during World War II and into the 1950s, when the tomb of St. Peter was being excavated underneath the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica, they would find like kind of Christian graffiti like in many of these places, but like in the ancient basilica that Constantine had built over the tomb of St. Peter the Apostle, it was like you would oftentimes find places for people. There were places for people to like reach through to be able to touch a piece of cloth or to reach through and to touch the tomb. And so the ability to sort of like even just be able to touch it, was something that was, a common practice, again, even in the ancient church. So the idea of like third class relics has a long history within the church as well. Alan? We do not, because I forgot to ask Ziegler's when I was having them do the altar. It's like, but we actually, at some point, I do actually want to have them cut a spot in the top of the altar, because we have in my office one of the old altar stones from the original 1954 church. And so we have a couple of altar stones because way back in mists of time in 1954, it's like when they consecrated the main altar and the side altars of the first church of St. Mary, they had relic stones. The relics were encased in a stone that was then set into the altar, and we still have those. And so I'm kind of like, I would like to put one of them into the. I would like to have one of them mounted into the altar that we have in the Marian Chapel. Unfortunately, I don't know that we still have the paperwork, so we don't necessarily know whose relics they are. I've had this problem in many old churches because when they would seal the relics in, they sealed them in. And so unless somebody was very careful about keeping the documentation somewhere where it could be found, people would forget, like, okay, whose relics are these? Now, if we were to open it, to like go in, have a stonemason go in and remove where it's sealed in and everything, it would have sort of a label, that would have it on there. But in general, we try not to disturb relics once they've been sort of set into an altar stone or something. Oh yeah, and that's that's a good question as well. I mean, there was a priest I knew who used to joke that he said, it's like, given how many relics are kept in churches all over the city of Rome, you probably don't want to be on the streets of Rome on the day of resurrection, because there's going to be body parts zooming all over the place. As I mean, God is able to knit us back together. It's like wherever, in however many places, our body parts may be scattered. And in normal circumstances, we would say it's like, yes, you don't really disturb somebody's tomb or something unless there's a really good reason. For instance, that they are now being venerated as a saint within the church or being venerated as a blessed. And there would be a reason to go in and extract relics for veneration, which is an ancient Christian practice. For most of us, that is probably not the case, and we can lie undisturbed in our graves or in our columbarium niche until the day of resurrection. This was something that actually became. It held up the cause of beatification for Fulton Sheen, because he had wanted at the time to be buried he was buried in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, but they were not pursuing his cause of beatification because he was a native of the diocese, and he had originally been ordained a priest in the Diocese of Peoria in Illinois. And there was this huge legal battle that ensued because Peoria wanted to be able to build a shrine to him. They were the ones doing his cause for beatification. They wanted him to be able to have a shrine located there with the remains of Fulton Sheen. Well, New York was kind of like, what are you talking about? It's like he asked to be buried in St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's like, why would you disturb his tomb? And it's like, eventually the court has decided in favor of Peoria, because they said Fulton Sheen couldn't have known that he was going to one day be canonized a saint or something. He couldn't have known when he made his funeral arrangements and said, "I want to be buried in St. Patrick's Cathedral." He couldn't have known that he was going to be raised to the honors of the altar someday. And this is a custom of the church with which the court doesn't have any interest in meddling. But they kind of, New York's argument was based on the fact that Fulton Sheen wanted to be buried in St. Patrick's Cathedral, and that's where he had been laid to rest. However, events have overtaken that. It's like, well, the Diocese of Peoria, which has shouldered the burden of his cause for beatification, was kind of like, we want to build a shrine and have his relics in a special shrine. Stanley Rother here in Oklahoma, had been buried. He had originally been buried in Okarche, his hometown at Holy Trinity Parish. When he was beatified and they were beginning to plan, for the huge church which has been built in Oklahoma City now, as a shrine for him, but at the time of his beatification, they had a special tomb at Resurrection Cemetery, the Catholic cemetery in Oklahoma City, where he was sort of temporarily laid to rest, because at his beatification, they also wanted to be able to extract relics to be distributed for veneration among the faithful. So they used that opportunity to be able to extract relics, at the time that he was exhumed from Holy Trinity. He was temporarily then in a tomb at Resurrection Cemetery in Oklahoma City. And then he moved to, but then he went to the, but then, of course, he is now in a tomb in the shrine in Oklahoma City. So there is a lot of precedent for within the church. Again, when it comes to the veneration of relics, for the ordinary person, no, we dissuade, sort of like, the idea of sort of like dividing up a person's remains. But at the same time, we also have a very long and ancient practice of venerating the relics of saints, and God will be able to knit us back together wherever we are and however we are, on the day of resurrection. I think Matt had a question.
Yes. Do you have any recommended readings on the Crusades, particularly as it relates to our faith history?
There are a number of good scholarly works on the Crusades. I can look some up and maybe give them to you. It's an interesting period in history, only because it really encompasses about a 300-year period of history. And so the Crusades really are kind of a fascinating period, but I'll look up some book recommendations and get them to you. Other questions? Do you have one, Susan?
If you wanted to get a relic, is there a specific group within the church?
Yes, there is a group of sisters that is in charge of, they have some sort, I mean, I've never been there. I don't know what it looks like on the inside, but there is actually, like at the Vatican, there is, in Rome, there is a group of sisters that manages the requests that come in for relics from all over the world. Now the church typically does not allow relics just for private veneration. And so usually it has to be at the request of a bishop requesting a relic, usually because it's for some church, or a church has requested a relic or something. They're typically not really, an ordinary person could not write and say, it's like, please send me, a piece of St. Francis of Assisi, and here's $5 for shipping and handling. It does not. That would not work. However, typically, like a person could request, if a church is being dedicated, the bishop may write to Rome and say, is there a relic available of this saint who's going to be the patron of the new parish, and we would like to have a first-class relic for the altar. They would arrange that. Like for Stanley Rother, sometimes it is managed even on, sometimes it is even managed on a more local level. Like for Stanley Rother, when I was in Tahlequah, we were getting a first-class relic of Stanley Rother, and all I had to really do, I was kind of surprised at how simple it was. All I had to do was write to the archdiocese and ask the archbishop, St. Bridget Parish would like to have a first-class relic of Blessed Stanley Rother, and we would like to have a first-class relic of Blessed Stanley Rother. It will be available for public veneration, because I was sort of told in advance, this is what you need to say. And, basically, it's like that, that it will be available for public veneration, that we will treat it with due care and honor, and so forth. And then, it kind of came in like registered mail, in a little priority mailbox, in a tiny little reliquary. So.
Is there a process now, a sanctioned process for obtaining relics? Because I know, Catherine of Siena's body is someplace and her head's someplace else.
Yeah, her head is in Siena. Her body is in the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva near the Pantheon. So.
I mean, in the old days, I guess they just cut them up for
Well, and this was this was part of the difficulty with Saint Catherine of Siena. It's like she died in Rome, and so she was buried in Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which was the Dominican church in Rome, and she was buried there. But the people of Siena were not happy because they're like, she lived most of her life here. She was a native Sienese. It's like, don't deprive us of being able to honor the saint who grew up and ministered here among us. And so yes, they were able to get. I think they have her thumb and they have her head at the Basilica of St. Catherine in Siena. Not me. Yes, I mean no. There is a process. I mean, oftentimes it happens after like decomposition, has set in, and so it's really a little bit like who does the forensic science stuff on NCIS. That there are experts who go in and do what's necessary. St. Catherine of Siena, I think, had been probably she'd probably been dead for some time, although she's also incorrupt. So that, I don't know, maybe that was a very messy process. But yeah, that is not a question I would have a really good answer to. Typically, I know that for instance, it's like when they opened the sarcophagus of St. Francis of Assisi, his tomb was in like this immense, stone sarcophagus in the Basilica of St. Francis. Inside of that was sort of like a lead casket, in which he had been buried. And so they very, there was a very long and detailed process. One of the things they want to make sure they do with relics is that any time that a relic is being exposed or a relic is being transferred or anything, it's like there's a whole crew of like officials there to ensure that nothing untoward happens during the transition of the relic. That as relics are being handled, they kind of make sure that it's like, okay, nobody's slipping in a substitute or something like that. I remember being horrified by a seminarian who told me when he was doing a tour of St. John Vianney's house in Ars, his rectory in Ars in France, that he'd like gotten like a splinter off his confessional. He like picked a splinter off his confessional. I was like, you defaced the St. John Vianney's confessional. But the thing is too, it's like, well, good luck ever getting that authenticated, because one of the things about relics is they always come with like paperwork. There's usually a wax seal as well, but like the paperwork for the relic is also something that's very important because it's what verifies its authenticity. The church has learned that it's like, yes, we in modern times now we try to ensure that everything has a definite provenance, that there are not like just, it's like, oh, I said this is a relic. It's like, well, you say so, but where is the documentation on it? Where is the signature of a bishop that says this came from this place and so forth. So one last question. Mm-hmm.
Keep the head safe. They can transport necessarily the whole body or
Yeah. Yeah, and in some ways, sometimes it has been a fortunate thing. Like we were very lucky when I was in Tahlequah. We had a first-class relic of Saint Bridget of Ireland, who is the patroness of the parish. But first-class relics of Saint Bridget of Ireland are very rare because her tomb was destroyed during the Protestant Reformation, along with the relics of Saint Patrick and Saint Columba. Most of the relics of those saints were lost during the Reformation when Protestants destroyed and scattered the relics. However, Saint Bridget's head had been brought by some crusading Irish knights and left in Portugal. And so there are relics of Saint Bridget of Ireland in Portugal, and some I think that are I think maybe in Cologne, Germany as well. But in some ways, it's kind of like, well, yes, it was rather fortunate in some ways that, yes, some of her relics had been brought. They were bringing them on the Crusades. Some of the knights, fell deathly ill and then miraculously recovered. And as a thank you, they left the head of Saint Bridget at a parish outside of Lisbon, Portugal. But it's the only source for like first-class relics now these days. Pam, did you have a question? Yes, there is, and I'm trying to remember the name of it now, but there is a parish in Pittsburgh that acquired one of the largest collections of relics in the world. It is an incredible. I have visited there, and it is literally like floor to ceiling, of this church, which has relics of all shapes and sizes. It is a pretty incredible place, and it was really a priest he was very involved in. He started sort of collecting relics, but he had also been very involved in helping to rebuild churches and monasteries over in Europe during after the Second World War. And as thank yous, these parishes would oftentimes send a relic as a thank you. The Benedictine Sisters of Perpetual Adoration in Clyde, Missouri also have a huge collection of relics that were thank yous from churches and abbeys and monasteries in Europe after World War I for the help that the sisters had offered in rebuilding many of the communities over in Europe that had been devastated by the world wars. And so there are sometimes like relic chapels that have amassed a huge number of relics. But the one in Pittsburgh is well worth visiting because it is one of the largest collections of relics, I think, in the world outside of the Vatican itself. So... Okay, very well. Thank you all so much. Emily said she does not actually have an announcement, so, but everybody have a wonderful time preparing for Holy Week. We'll just go ahead and close in prayer in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you all.